thank you for joining us for this conversation. Who is Jodi? Where are you from? And how did you come to this position with the Presbytery?
Gosh, well, I'm not from anywhere. My father was in the military, so I grew up all over the place. But if I had to call someplace home, it would be northwestern Pennsylvania because my grandparents lived there. And I am a cradle Presbyterian because that's where I started with my grandfather in his tiny little church in northwestern Pennsylvania. And every time we moved, which was every 1 to 2 years, it always included a visit to them. It was home. And I wound up going to seminary in Washington, D.C. I had a previous career in business development in the defense industry. And God and I were talking past each other for a few years and finally wound up in seminary. And I've been ordained since 2016. My husband was in the government and he recently retired 3 years ago. That's how we came to Winston-Salem.
Gotcha.
Our daughter graduated from Wake Forest, so that's how we found out about Winston-Salem. And we are delighted to be here. And after arriving, 6 months later, COVID hit. So I had the blessing of being in a church. At the time, I was at Clemens Presbyterian as an associate. And so that was my home for a few years. So my title is Designated Presbyter for Transformational Ministry. The focus of my position is to be with those churches who do not have installed ministries. So in this presbytery, we have 70 churches out of 130 who do not have installed ministries. So that's close to 55%. And of those, 19 of those are African American churches, and 15 of those do not have installed ministries, and that's closer to 80%. Wow. So it's pretty sobering. Wow. I might make your jaw drop just a little more in that one of the things that I've noticed as I've been working with some of these churches is they don't interface with Presbytery. They don't have a relationship. And so when I go back and I looked, for example, in July at our Presbytery meeting, 83% of those churches did not attend Presbytery. And then in this last September meeting, 92% did not attend. So there's different reasons for different months and different times, et cetera. But to me, anything that's above 20% should be getting our attention. Each one of these 70 churches, they're wandering in their own little wilderness because they're not connected to Presbytery. And that's one of the things I share with them when I go in is that you aren't alone. The issues that you're going through right now, every other church in this presbytery is going through those on different levels, but all of them are. When
we talk about 15 out of the 19 African American churches, what all are the factors there?
I think we're just starting to uncover what those are, and it's across all denominations, not just ours, but obviously culture is a huge factor. And so in our African American churches, there are far fewer folks going into seminary to begin with. Far fewer of those are African American. And so at the other end, when you graduate seminarians, there are far fewer folks in general. Now, there are other things that affect the African American tradition too, and each church is different. Each church has its own personality, its own family. So it's not entirely fair to categorize everybody the same way. But what I can say about all of our churches, I would say we are all suffering from, and this isn't rocket science, but with culture and with the changing times, declining membership, declining revenues, aging congregations. And when you begin that with predominantly white congregations, you can see how that might impact the African American churches as well. Those are things that are definite issues that we're all trying to address. Then you put COVID on top of that, which threw everybody into a tailspin. And how do we recover from that? That's something we're all trying to think about, because ministry now should be transformed for every church. It doesn't matter what size you are. We all need to be thinking about how we transform, not just reposition, not just adjust, but transform.
One thing that we can be certain of is that COVID has transformed all of our churches. If you take out all of the other cultural trends that were going before that, we are just now at the point of trying to figure out who is in our church, who's still engaged, where are they, and how engaged are they compared to where they were before.
You know, COVID forced us to transform. Not all of us were capable of doing that, and not all of us did. So it involves some degree of technology, some degree of expense. And we still have churches out there that don't Zoom. We have churches that will never live stream or record sermons. So that's another barrier we need to look to get through.
One thing that I do want to point out is that we happen to be sitting in the Sanctuary of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Winston-Salem, which has recently decided to close its doors as a Presbyterian congregation. And I thought it was fitting for us to sit here in this place where those difficult decisions have been going on and are still going on as to what do we do now and what do we do with the property and so forth. Those are terribly difficult decisions, and I'm wondering how many other congregations that you've been in touch with since you started this position that are in that same situation or nearing it?
Gosh, every single one of them, Ken. Almost all of them, because I'm working with some sessions who have been the same session for the last 10 years because their congregation is so small. You can imagine that the energy level is pretty low. So the ability to think about not only getting through COVID, but how do we minister on the other side of that, and trying to prevent us from becoming congregations that are serving facilities as opposed to serving God's children, being the hands and feet of Christ in our world. One of the things I want to do, first of all, is to physically be present with a session or a congregation. So first I will try to worship with them or meet with their session and explain to them that I have some resources that I would like to present to them. And the resources cover these areas we just talked about: financial, property, and then a spiritual assessment. And these are not report cards. Nobody else sees them. They're not going back to Presbytery. These are just to help us understand what our reality is. And everybody's reality is a bit different, but we have to be honest about what we're looking at. Not, gee, I think we're in bad shape, but we're a breath away from a catastrophic property issue that could bankrupt the church. We have to be honest with that. And so when we do those things, that helps us establish a baseline. And at that point, it gives us the ability to start to derive some options for these sessions to consider. And every session I enforce to them or emphasize to them that these are their decisions. Nobody's going to tell them what to do. These are their decisions. We're there to walk alongside them. We're there to support them. And in that regard, the next thing that happens is if they need additional support because they don't have volunteers, because they are tired, whatever the reasons may be, the Task Force for the Changing Church, which is a new task force, has shepherding teams that we're putting together. And 2 to 3 folks are made available to each church that is requesting additional help, because presenting ideas to a church that is unable to move forward because their session isn't meeting any longer, because they have no clerk, those are the kinds of things that they have to, we have to help them address. They can't do it on their own, and we're a relational denomination.
Right.
That's what we believe in. We're there to support each other. We network, we uphold, and sometimes it's in prayer, sometimes it's in physical presence, sometimes it's in expertise that we might be able to offer. So that's the plan, that's the hope. God always gets involved, and the Holy Spirit sometimes changes us mid-course, but right now that's how we've been moving out, and that's what we did here at Covenant. We did what we call a church empowerment assessment. We conducted, we looked at the finances, we looked at their property issues. It's an inventory that they take. And then the session themselves complete the spiritual assessment. It's only 20 questions. And the whole thing, soup to nuts, that all can be done easily within a day. And it's different folks. It's not for one person to do, but different folks can do it. And at the end of that, that gives us a baseline to operate from, to say, okay, here's where we are. What are our options? And in the case of covenant, we had a team of folks, an administrative commission actually, that put together 26 options. And so there were a lot of options.
Yeah.
But where this church is right now, its energy level, its time frame for moving forward seems to be coming to a close. And that was what the session recognized. And it was clear that in all the conversations that they had, it felt not only something that they were looking at on a piece of paper, but it was a very spiritual experience as well. There was a lot of prayer. There were some tears. But at the end of the day, the session was very comfortable and felt that this is where they were being called by God at this point in the life of this church.
Yeah. How are people responding to that or reacting to it, to the information that they're getting?
So that's a great question, and it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
So I would say if you were talking to a session and you say things like, okay, these numbers reflect a declining revenue, declining attendance, declining membership, increased property costs, they would say, tell us something we don't know. We already know that. So how do we move forward from that?
Right.
Because sometimes things are more easily accomplished than what a church may feel. They may feel that they have no options. There's only 20 of us that show up for worship, or 10, or 5. And the money isn't where it used to be, and people aren't coming back. We have no options, when in fact they do. They really, truly do. It's just a different way of looking at how they want to be present and how they are involved and connected to their communities. Yeah. The two things that really are surprising to me, and I'd want to make sure that these are understood not as criticisms, but as observations, is what I would call the lack of leadership and sustained leadership. And that's not that people aren't trained to be leaders. It's just that when you are tiny communities and you don't have installed ministry, having consistency, having consistent leadership, having consistent messages from your pulpit, it's much harder to accomplish that.
Oh, yeah.
Same with moderating.
Yeah.
A lot of folks don't have the same moderator consistently. And so developing a vision, reimagining, thinking about what God is calling them to in this next chapter becomes much more difficult. And so leadership is one issue. The other issue that I find consistently, and this is another, maybe I would say indirect result, is lack of understanding of who we are as Presbyterians. Our polity, our Reformed tradition, what we believe. And, part of that comes from we're a global culture anymore. And folks aren't cradle pick a thing. They come from different traditions, and we welcome that. But they also come with different ideas that they learned in different churches in different places across the way. So when you get to this place, a PCUSA church, a lot of folks now are so focused on survival that they've sort of missed the focus about who we are as Presbyterians, as God's children, how we're called to be, who we're called to be. Covenant was impacted by an embezzlement. They did not have the ability to recover from that. Presbytery stepped in and helped them get their feet back under themselves to be able to at least go through this process. So, but that doesn't always happen. And budgeting successfully, anticipating costs, especially in this day and age, that's a challenge as well.
Yeah, sure.
So understanding, one of the other things I wanted to mention is that I will always ask a church, how do you define being church? What does that mean to you? And in a lot of little churches, it's whether we can find pulpit supply on Sunday, whether we can pay our bills, Something else that I think is critical with all these churches, every single one of them, the first thing I want them to understand is their success has nothing to do with how many members they have or how big their revenue is.
Another fallacy that I hear very often is, well, we've got to attract young people, which is wonderful. Nobody's against attracting young people, but aging congregations, if we can use that phrase, can attract other aging people. I mean, there are congregations in retirement communities that thrive, and there are no young people there. So the fallacy to say, well, if we don't have young people, we won't survive, is also there too, isn't it?
Yes, and the other thing I would point out is I always tell churches, you limit the Holy Spirit when you say you need young children, because the Holy Spirit works in so many different ways.
Right.
And if you want to engage children and young families because you envision growth down the line, that's a wonderful thing to have, but it takes time.
Right.
And these churches that we're talking about, that's the other message, unfortunately, I'm the one to bear, is that time is not our friend. Time is not our friend. We need to just regroup, redefine who we are right now, and prepare to listen to how God is going to move us forward and understand what energy level we have to do that. Because if it's not us, these people sitting here today, maybe it's the legacy that we pass to the folks that come after us in terms of whatever a ministry may become. So on the one hand, I admire and respect traditions that have come before, that we grew up under, that formed a lot of our aging congregations today. And I respect and honor that. I'm one of those people. But I also understand that you can't keep worshiping like that and expect the rest of the world to fall in line. And so it is heartbreaking to me when I walk into congregations that have absolutely no interest in what I may offer them.
What is the most exciting and hopeful part of what you're doing?
Thank you so much for asking that, because I've just shared all these things that are heavy things. But at the end, the only thing I would want people to walk away from is there is so much hope. I see it in every one of these little churches. The hope that I would hope everybody would take away is that in each one of these churches, two things hit me. First of all, I am so inspired and humbled by the faithful that continue to show up no matter their age. We talk about aging congregations. I'll tell you what, I would love to be, I hope I'm 96 years old and still coming to church every Sunday trying to figure out how to be a part of supporting my community. I see that in almost every one of these churches that I'm in. And then the other piece would be of hope is that each one of these communities is uniquely different, just like each of our families, each of our churches, each of us, uniquely different. And with all of those differences comes unique, incredible opportunities. I have yet to walk into even the most rural church and not see opportunity abound all around. And I always am grateful for every session I sit down with that we are the people called to this place in this time to do these amazing things because we believe in a God of abundance. We don't have a God of scarcity. We have a God of abundance and hope. We are resurrection people. We are Easter people, and it's being laid out before us. So that is the hope that I see in every community, and I hope each community sees in itself.